So I do a big introduction, but I feel I've already used a lot of time, and I've spent a lot of time in hospital recently, so there's been a lot of time to think and read and pray. So let's get to it. Okay, so I am as king, ruling with justice and righteousness, a shepherd to the people. That's what a king is supposed to be. Okay, even the best, David and Solomon, when it came to representing God, fell short. I want to bring up Exodus 19, verse 8. Okay. This was whenever Israel stated, and all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So this is the moment that Israel said, whatever it is that the Lord requires, we'll do it. Whether it was in naivety or arrogance or a little of both, we'll never really know. But I think we can all thank them for that moment. This was the moment that we were all put under law. This was the moment that God had to show us that we couldn't do it on our own. This, like I said, they said they could fulfill the promises of God. They didn't even know what it was yet. They didn't know what the law was. Taking on responsibility for blessings and putting themselves under a set of requirements of righteousness and holiness. If you look at all the favoritism God showed to them before this, it's really tragic. You know that whenever God spoke to Abraham, that the law was not his plan. That wasn't the plan to bless the seed of Abraham. Okay, so I'm setting up. Don't worry. All right. You know that God didn't actually want Israel to have a king either? Yeah? Okay. Some scholars in the house. He was their king. But the people asked for a king, and God again gave them what they asked for. King Saul. And Saul fell very short. He was afraid of the opinions of men, and they worried him far more than the opinions of God. God had to choose someone else, someone after his own heart to represent him. And he chose David. Like I said, God didn't want to give the people the law, and he didn't want to give them King Saul either. In Saul, we see a picture of the law. And in David, by contrast, we see a shadow of grace. Or Jesus, the personification of grace. What was it that God audibly spoke over Jesus at his baptism so that a whole crowd could hear? And it said, it's Matthew 3:17. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. What does the name David mean? Beloved. Heard it from the front row. Some of you may have seen the poster I put in the WhatsApp group. What does the name Saul mean? It means asked for. The people asked for a king, and they got Saul. There was, of course, another very famous Saul in the New Testament, and he would become the Apostle Paul, one of the greatest communicators of the good news in history. Of course, not before inflicting callous harm to the early church. He was willfully complicit in the stoning of Stephen, and by his own admission, a Pharisee of Pharisees, who would have known the law so inside and out that he was someone who would have known that you had to be without sin to cast the first stone. Yet he endorsed it. Because by that point, the law had been lowered to a level that men thought they could keep. It had been lowered to a level that they thought they could achieve, or at least the elite could achieve. Okay, and in that he was able to boast in his own ability, like any of the Pharisees at the time. That was essentially their status. That was their currency. And honestly, Saul of Tarsus, until that moment on the road to Damascus, to me, that was the accumulation. This was the man the people asked for. Now, it wasn't who God wanted. God turned him around. So, we've talked about the king. I want to talk about the priest and the prophet for just a moment. The role of a priest is to represent a man to God. It's to represent man to God. A high priest of Israel who entered the Holy of Holies in his own righteousness would die. And he'd have to be, they used to tie the rope, as we know. They used to tie a rope around the ankle of the high priest just in case he would die inside, so they could pull him out. It was bad news for the whole nation if that happened. And thankfully we're not under a high priest that's a man. Jesus is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And if you need any more information on that, well, you missed out, because Saints was awesome. I'd highly recommend Jude. Okay. On the other hand, from a priest, a prophet represented God to the people. Jesus was the ultimate prophet, because if you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father, which is John 14:9. I am going to rattle through some scriptures. There are a lot of them, so I'm not going to bring them all up on the screen. I'm just going to say them so people can check what I've said. Okay. Being an Old Testament prophet was pretty serious business. If you read Deuteronomy 18:15-22, if a prophet said something in the name of God and it wasn't what God told him to say, or if what he said didn't come to pass, the sentence was death. A prophet was to say what God told them to say, nothing more, nothing less. Jesus once described himself as greater than Jonah, which got me thinking, what made Jonah great? It's not much of a boast if he's just some guy. So, you've seen the poster, and despite the fact he didn't in fact take down the... we'll get to it. There's a guy who, this is basically just a guy who was told to go to Nineveh and warn them that they needed to repent. It took 3 days to walk through Nineveh, which had a population of more than 120,000 people. They had this awkward habit of putting Jewish heads on spikes. Jonah didn't want to go. But as you can see from the expression in the picture I posted on his face, it wasn't because he was afraid of them. Still, he went in the opposite direction and got on a boat to Even God Can't Find Me Here, which is assuming was somewhere near Larne. Then came the storms, and realizing that he was the problem, Jonah ends up tossed overboard in the raging sea. That's whenever he gets swallowed whole and spends 3 days in the belly of a large sea creature of much speculated origin. Was it a big fish? Was it a whale? Was it Nessie? Nobody actually knows from the Hebrew, but some people feel incredibly passionate about it. I personally like the large sea monster translation. So I went for the megalodon shark in the image. In the belly of the beast, Jonah relents and agrees to God's request. It was very big of him. The large sea monster spits him out on dry land, and Jonah heads to Nineveh. Now, like I said, it takes 3 days to walk through Nineveh. Jonah walks for 1 day. Jonah preached 8 words in English. Jonah 3:4. It says, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh will be overthrown." I've been told, as feedback on my preaching from some people, that I need to speak up more. I have nothing on Jonah. Okay, so this, the word for him speaking can be translated as utter. It can also be translated as speaking without words. He was not excited to be there. He was not excited to do what God had sent him to do. And it's not like he even went to the king. He went to the marketplace. He walked 1 day into a city that took 3 days to walk into and muttered something about repentance. And the Ninevean gossip train did the rest. Nineveh repented towards God, and Jonah was ecstatic. No, he was raging. And prayed that God would let him die. For it was seemingly better that he die than God have mercy on the people of Nineveh. So I ask again, what made Jonah great? He laid out exactly why he didn't want to do what God had asked of him. And I think this is the key. He says to God, "For I know that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents concerning calamity." Look at his opinion of God. He didn't have a great opinion of the people of Nineveh. Oh, look, they probably earned it. But he felt really, really comfortable throwing an absolutely petulant and childish tantrum at God. He had a really good opinion of God. And you know what? He went and he said what God told him to say. And he didn't add his own opinions. Sometimes less is more. With all of that in mind, I want to bring up Moses. Okay, now, Moses is one of the greatest of God's representatives in history, but he was human. So whenever we talk about typology, we talk about pictures of Christ in the Old Testament, I really like the word shadows. They talk about pictures and shadows, and I really like the word shadows because whenever the light moves, the shadow moves the other direction. And sometimes we see Jesus in people, and sometimes we see us. And somebody else is even Jesus in that moment. You know, so it's not as though one person is continually Jesus throughout the entire story of their lives, because that would be Jesus. You know, that wouldn't be a picture anymore. So whenever we're looking at Moses was amazing. Moses is an incredible picture of Christ through so much of his life. And I feel a bit like talking about this part of his life. It's like, for those of you who care, it's like describing Roberto Baggio as someone that missed a penalty while injured. It's not fair to him. But you know what? Here we are. And the people were thirsty and complaining. And frankly, they were always complaining. Moses was told to strike the rock and water would pour forth. Ever tried to get water out of a rock? Sometimes we read passages in the Bible and it just says, yeah, he was told to strike a rock and water would pour forth. And that wasn't even the point of what's being said. It's just like, wrap your head around that for a moment. It's like, the man that needed healed, the angel would come and stir the pool. Wait a second, back up. Okay. So from 1 Corinthians 10:4, we know that the rock was Christ. And water is a symbol of the Holy Spirit, and it flowed out whenever the rock was struck, whenever Jesus was struck. I promise I'm not going to post any pictures of Jesus played by the rock. After Jesus had died on the cross, they pierced him with a spear, and blood and water flowed out of him, and many would say that's a picture of the birth of the church. It also, by the way, gives us his cause of death, just from a medical perspective. It wasn't asphyxiation or any of the other ways that people die on crosses. It was cardiac rupture. He died of a broken heart. However, Jesus was struck once. He was struck once and for all time. And he's not to be struck again, and he won't be struck again. The first time that Moses struck the rock and water flowed, God had instructed Moses to strike it. That was the picture of Christ for the people, and the prophet did as he was told. However, that was in Exodus 17:6. And by the time we get to Numbers 20, the striking is over. The water has been poured out. The people have been revived. So what happens whenever they get thirsty? They come back to the prophet and they come back to the rock. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. I used to believe that whenever Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children from a child's lunch, that he took it, broke it, offered it up to God with thanks, and then he divided it among the disciples to distribute among the people. I thought that it multiplied in the disciples' hands or baskets, and it was only whenever I got to the book of Luke that I realized that disciples went back to Jesus each time for more, and he gave them more each time. We need to keep going back to Jesus, which is wonderful because it means we're not responsible for multiplying what he gives us. That's his job. We give our little bit to him, not the other way around. He returns so much more. And when we give to Jesus, as that young boy did his lunch, how much more can he do with it? So we've covered, you have to keep going back. Keep going back. So it was okay that the people came back. Maybe not complain quite so much. But, people are people. Now, back to Moses. The people were far from perfect. And as I've already covered, they complained seemingly constantly. And you know what? Moses, the great prophet who led them out of Egypt, enriched them. Well, God had done all of that through him. He was pissed, for want of a better word. So in Numbers 28, when God says to Moses, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation to speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You thus shall bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink." See there? After striking, a symbol of the crucifixion, the relationship with the rock has changed. Last time the rock had to be struck. This time, it's to be spoken to. So why did God tell him to take his rod if he's just going to speak? It wasn't a setup. It was a shepherd's rod. Moses was a shepherd in the desert. Remember when I said about the start, about a king shepherding the people? This was his flock. David, who we'll get to later, was famously a shepherd. He wrote Psalm 23, which opens, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in lack." Probably the most famous psalm of all time, maybe only rivaled by 91. Moses was to get up as a shepherd, speak to Jesus, the rock, and the Spirit, the water, was to flow in life, provision, and abundance, to provide for, to cleanse, and to refresh. That's what should have happened. What actually happened was Moses let his emotions get the better of him. Numbers 20:10 says, "Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Moses then struck the rock twice. And that was it. The prophet representing God had spoken out of turn. He had presented God as being angry and volatile, and had struck the rock twice, ruining the picture of Christ they were foreshadowing. Moses, for all the good he'd done, was out, and he died out. Of course, we know God. We know his character. We know that what Jonah had to say about him was true. So God being God, he managed to take the whole situation and treat it with the seriousness that it deserved. He answered Moses' prayers to allow him to walk in the promised land. He just made him wait 1,500 years. God has a sense of humor. Moses prayed that God would let him walk into the promised land and die. Instead, he died and then walked in the promised land with Jesus and Elijah in the Garden of Gethsemane. Elijah, on the other hand, of course, prayed that God would let him die, and he never died. So, if you're waiting on an answer to prayer, wait longer. I don't say that without compassion. If you're waiting on an answer to prayer, but wait longer. God doesn't need good circumstances to bless you. But what if you had fallen? What if you did believe the lies? What if you went back to your old life? Okay, the book of Hosea, God compares Israel worshiping other gods to adultery. And the people need a picture. We've seen over and over again, people need a picture. I need pictures. I even see words as pictures. I really need pictures. Something they can see and feel, something they can understand. So this is the reason for the seat, because I'm going to sit down and tell you a story, like I do my daughter every night. Okay. So, once upon a time, there was a young woman named Gomer. And Gomer was young, she was reasonably attractive, and she had bills to pay. She hadn't had an easy life. She'd been hurt. She didn't have a lot of autonomy in her life, but she had value. And she knew she had value as it was measurable. A man would bid on her in back alley auctions. It's not much, but to Gomer it might have been proof that she was worth something. One day, like any other, Gomer was just going about her business whenever a famous prophet called Hosea, who has posted, I think Liam Neeson could play Hosea, asked for her hand in marriage. And the gossip was juicy that week. What did Gomer think of Hosea? Well, honestly, pretty much everybody had a good opinion of Hosea. This was the most questionable thing he'd done. Everyone had an opinion about Gomer too. And that opinion was getting a lot more airtime recently. Hosea talked to God, and God talked back to Hosea. That's a big deal today, but as we've already established, being an Old Testament prophet was a pretty grave business. They would not have been uploading weekly, "Thus saith the Lord's," to YouTube, because if the prophecy didn't come to pass, well, discreditation and stoning. Truthfully, God didn't give Hosea much information. Israel had been going through a period of national prosperity. The economy was good, but they turned to other gods. So he tells Hosea in Hosea 1:2, "Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." I think I would be asking, is that all, Lord? Hosea and Gomer get married, and she bears 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. So far, so good. That is until one day, whenever Hosea comes home, and the 3 kids are there, but Gomer's gone. She left him. So what does Hosea do? Does he curse her? Start a smear campaign? It wouldn't be difficult. He could fly around like a hero, saving face. Does he let her lie in the bed that she's made? And this is a big one, honestly. Remember, this is a prophet representing God to the people. Does he treat her like she's replaceable? Jonah clearly wasn't. But was she? We don't know every thought that passed through the mind of this very human man. But what we do know is that the prophet Hosea, who by this stage, who knows what's going through his head, he went knocking doors in that part of town. Imagine the scandal. The prophet marries a whore, and they have 3 children. Then she leaves him. She would have seen the very worst of men, but she left him. And the first thing he does is go down to the red quarter, or the red light district, knocking on doors that a prophet should never be seen darkening. Have you seen her? Has anyone seen my wife? Where's Gomer? He would undoubtedly have had doors closed and doubts about his intentions, until eventually he got the answer. And actually, Hosea, we have seen her. Do you want to come through here? Jewish historians tell us that the scene Hosea would have walked in on was Gomer, his wife, standing on a block, probably naked, as men bid on her. This was all she felt she was worth. This was where she felt she belonged. You know, life probably wasn't easy for Gomer, even after becoming Hosea's wife. I can imagine her past was rarely overlooked by the religious establishment or the good-living people of the town. I can imagine it wasn't nice. I can imagine exactly why she would feel that she didn't belong in a prophet's world, never mind his bed. Think about this from her perspective for a moment. She had made her choice, but try to put yourself in her shoes just for a second. And the second I want you to choose is the moment she looked up and in walked Hosea. What must have run through her mind in that moment? What was he doing here? Did he even know she was there? Had God called him to another wife of whoredom? What would he say? What would he do? Do you think anybody would notice if I just stepped off this block for a moment and thermally combusted? Honestly, her shame must have been excruciating. If she wasn't suicidal before, I imagine in that moment she was definitely suicidal. So what did the prophet do? It was established the prophet was to represent God. Well, if you've read the book, or or think of him as a prophet, or even if you know that the name Hosea means to save, it comes from the same root word as the name Yeshua or Jesus. Now keep in mind, they're already married. He has every right to say, that's my wife. She's mine. I'll be taking her home. What he does instead is the reason this story is told. Hosea raises his hand. Whatever the cost, I'll pay it. He redeems her. He pays 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. Now, barley is peasant's bread. It's usually mixed with salt and olive oil before it's being offered. And this symbolized the grain offering, like the one offered in temples, a free will offering, giving thanks to God for his provision. Note there was olive oil in the peasant's bread. Look at what Luke 4:18 says. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. Anointed to the poor. Jesus, born in Bethlehem, the house of bread, who at the Lord's table took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body, not wheat, the bread of the wealthy, barley, the bread of the poor." Mixed with it olive oil, the same oil used for anointing. It also parallels the barley that Boaz gave Ruth at his bedside. Although her Jewish mother had to explain the significance of that, which I think in itself is kind of typology. Silver. Silver is the great biblical symbol of redemption. So, there were 10 ephahs in a homer. And there were 1.5 homers of barley. That's 15 ephahs of barley. In the silver and the barley, we have another picture of Christ. How much silver was it? 15 shekels. How much barley? 15 ephahs. What does the number 15 symbolize in the Bible? The number 14 is deliverance. What comes after deliverance? The number 15. Number 15 symbolizes rest. The name Joshua is also derived from the same root word as Jesus and Hosea. And just as Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, which the Lord called my rest, Hosea rested Gomer. He sat her down, and to paraphrase, and I've paraphrased a few of these things. Gomer, I am yours, and you are mine. This is exclusive, precious, and set apart. Their marriage was restored, and when the Lord restores, it's better than it was before. Gomer knew her value to him. She knew her value. Her value was whatever it takes. She was worth more to him than his reputation. She was worth so much. And actually, we see that in, obviously, it's not God's plan for people to sin, and it's not God's plan for people to require salvation. But now we know, having been on that side and then being redeemed, just how much God was willing to pay for us, just how much we are valued and loved. We know what Adam and Eve didn't. So I said that because I lost my place. Right. So their marriage symbolizes so much. Honestly, the biggest thing I think people miss about the Bible is that it's a love story. It's not one of pomp, duty, and ceremony. It's a passionate romance. And we know Hosea means to save. Well, Gomer means complete, finished. To save completely in a finished work, saved into rest. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. We can have that because, in case you haven't put it together yet, Hosea represents Jesus in the story, and Gomer represents me. And you. And everyone else you know. Everyone who's gone too far. Everyone who's left the house of salvation. Everyone who struggles with addiction, be it substances, abuse, pornography, worry. You've just heard the story of Hosea. What's your opinion of Hosea now? What's your opinion of Jesus? Because if you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. Everyone you know is savable. The word is already finished and complete. And honestly, some people act like some people are difficult for Jesus to save, but Jesus could save a PDF to a calculator. It's... So what of the challenges we face? If we know that God is willing and able to save us, provide for us, protect us, prosper us, what happens when we don't see the blessing immediately? What happens when we have to wait, basically, is what I mean. What happens when the enemy casts its own shadow and questions all you know to be true? All right, so thank you, Tiffany. I'll put this back just in case you have to give me a hint with the glory pads. When I was 21 or 22, I had a small group of friends who meant an awful lot to me. They still do. I don't see them much anymore, but we used to go out to pubs and clubs. And, the ones that played alternative music. Mark knows he was there. I didn't know him then. Places where local bands would play, that sort of stuff. But whenever I went out to meet my friends, I used to drive. A lot. And it was for 3 reasons. The first one was that once I got my wristband, I could give my ears a break and go out and get sneaky Chinese. The second one was that I didn't have to figure out how to get home. And the third one, and most importantly to me, was that I drove my friends home. These people I loved, I got my friends home safe. Sometimes on my shoulder. that part of the night was my favorite. The music in my car was better. We'd had fun, but this was always the part of the night with the biggest laughs. Our friend Holly lived over near Knocknagonie Tesco's, or big Tesco's to those in the know. That's only big Tesco. Generational issues. No sense of decorum. All right. Look, this is clearly the part you've all been waiting for. I finally brought up Tesco. Back then, big Tesco was open 24 hours. And I have this memory of us sitting under this beautiful starlit sky, because on the way to drop Holly off, we'd all decided to just go and sit in a car park, because that's what you did. And in that, we were only there a short time whenever this whole group of young guys came running out of Tesco. And back then, you could buy a baguette at 2 a.m. for about 10p, and it was like a rock. And these guys, not a single girl amongst them, started to act out these full, like, Star Wars trilogy scenes. And I'd never seen Star Wars at the time, and can I tell you, it does not live up to what they put in front of me. It was awesome. Can't. And honestly, look, fair play to them, but I must say, I don't think any of them had ever been in a real fight in their lives. But one thing sort of just stuck with me. Their bread became their weapon. The enemy's bread, well, the enemy's weapon becomes our bread. Whenever we look at the Hebrew, the words for bread and fight, bread is lahem, and it comes from the root word laham, which is the verb. That's to fight. The two words are intrinsically linked, and they're only really separated by context and inflection. I don't think that's any mistake. If you remember Caleb, whenever the Israelites were freaking out about a few giants in the Promised Land, and Caleb says, they will be our bread. Numbers 14:9. He's saying we'll devour them. The Lord's with us. This is not a concern. When two or more are gathered together in his name, he is there in our midst. And whenever we break bread, God fights on our behalf. And honestly, as Psalm 97:5 says, if the mountains melt like wax in the presence of the Lord, what concern do we have of the giants that live on that mountain? They probably aren't the issue we've made them out to be. Honestly, I'm going to cut across to David. Do you know Goliath's brothers? I was looking at their names. Lachmi is Goliath's brother, and it's a word derived directly from Lachem, for bread. The Philistines were of Greek origin, and the name from there suggests, provider. But to the Hebrews, it couldn't have been much more on the nose. 300 years before, Caleb said the giants will be our bread. Honestly, he may as well have been called like Hovis or something. Like, Speaking of David and Goliath, on a personal level, I've had a hard month. In truth, I've had about 5 hard months. The Lord has adventured my family through some things I wouldn't choose for my family to walk. When I've got battles to fight, I go to Jesus. And very often he reveals himself to me in David. I have a great affinity with David. I know that Pastor Samuel likes to liken Mark and I to the giants, but I identify much more as David. Now, truth be told, if you're going through pictures, shadows in the Bible, it's a little shallow to just insert yourself into the position of the hero of the story. You know, the hero of the story is Jesus. He is the main character energy of this existence. But you know, like it's you go arguably a layer deeper, and as Christ is, so are we in this world, and we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. David had mighty men. So, yes, Jesus is the main character, but it doesn't mean you have to be village person number 13. It's okay to take inspiration from these stories and expect that if you want to go, God will take you on an adventure, and it'll be exciting. And you'll see more of him and get to know him with more intimacy if you just walk with him. It's okay to be the person that believes and trusts God when others are struggling. It's okay. You actually don't have to apologize for that. So David, why do I identify as David? David was good looking, ruddy complexion. He was a skilled musician with a stringed instrument, and his smack talk was on point. Okay. I might do a full parallel between David and Jesus at some point, but it's vast, deep, and beautiful, but not today because I've got 4 minutes. I'm joking. There's no way I'm sticking to 4 minutes. All right, so I'm not really here to talk about David particularly. I want to look at Goliath for a moment. There's been a little bit of a modern move to reframe the exchange between David and Goliath as an evolution in technology. As though nobody ever thought to throw something at the giant before. From the measurements we have in the Bible, Goliath was probably 9'9". So that's me and more than half of me again. That said, it's much harder to measure somebody's height with their head cut off. The number 6 is, in the Hebrew, is the number of humanity, effort, and human endeavor. Goliath comes with 6 pieces of armor, all made of bronze. Bronze is the biblical symbol of judgment. Goliath comes with the judgment of man, and his name means expose. Goliath exposed people. King Saul was a big guy. He was a king, a leader, and he was the only one in Israel who had his own bronze armor. Saul was exposed. Arguably, this was his fight. But he couldn't fight this giant for his people. In the natural, yeah, absolutely not. Goliath was like a lion. It had torn him apart. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." Jesus is the Lion of Judah. Satan comes like a roaring lion. He presents the image of an angry, judgmental God. but it's only like a lion. He's all talk. A bit like Goliath in this sense. For though we know that he had a decorated and successful military career prior to encountering a shepherd, much like Satan, all Goliath does in the story is talk. Goliath calls for a single soldier to come out and face him. Look at his tactics. He seeks to isolate, expose, and destroy. These are the tactics of a hunting lion. He taunts Israel, questioning their calling and questioning their God. And for a lion, these tactics remind me a lot of the serpent. Honestly, the same spirit spoke to David through his brother, but that's a different message. What I want to talk about is Goliath's armor. I want to talk about Goliath's armor and the armor of God. So if you have a moment. Goliath comes in bronze, judgment, 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 and he brought a sword, which is a symbol of authority. What defeated the army of Israel up to the point that David arrived wasn't any of his armor. It was obviously just unbelief. David wasn't put off by that. He faced lions and bears. David came as a shepherd, just as Moses was supposed to. He brought with him 5 stones that had been smoothed by the flowing water, a picture of the Spirit, 5 being the number of grace. And he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, which is the same I am that spoke to Moses, the Yud-He, Vav-He, Yahweh, that was engraved above Jesus' head at the crucifixion. And the words of hosts, which sounds really good whenever educated Christian people say it from platforms. But I don't know about you, but I never had a clue what it said or what it meant. It also translates as armies. I'm reminded of the prophet Elisha's servant and how the eyes of his heart were opened. And he went from being very afraid of the adversaries who had surrounded them to being in awe of the spiritual army of protectors who would outmuscle, outflank, and outnumber them. Every piece of the Lord's armor in Ephesians 6-10-18 has to do with the new covenant of grace. Any chink in your belief in these areas leaves you vulnerable. But under grace, there are no chinks. Holes only appear when you try to take responsibility for your own protection. So, I have all these details about the armor, and I'd love to share them with you, but maybe I'll have to another day. I'll end somewhere else. Okay? Because essentially the armor is Jesus. Goliath comes in judgment and the strength of man. He's a perfect picture of it. And we come with the armor of God. We come protected and provided for by Jesus. So all typology is going to lead to him. And listening to the story of Hosea and Gomer, perhaps you've gotten an even greater sense of who Jesus is today. So reveal Jesus to each other. He is our salvation, righteousness, truth, peace, and supply. And I leave you with this. So, I'm 2 minutes late. When Satan convinced men to crucify Jesus, he had no idea what a weapon the cross would become. Don't be afraid whenever giants come in judgment. The provision is always there. In fact, they will be your bread. No weapon formed against us shall prosper. What the devil means for evil, God turns around for good. And the very last thought. You know, whenever David told Goliath he was going to cut off his head, only one of them had a sword. Thank you.